Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. Hello, Amanda. I heard you had a birthday recently, so happy belated birthday. Were you able to celebrate it? I'd love to hear about that and maybe some other interesting things going on in your life.
Thanks, Jason. Thankfully, I was able to celebrate. Restaurants reopened a few days ago in Ottawa, and so I went to a Persian Mediterranean restaurant and had a lot of Middle Eastern food with two of my closest friends. So that was quite a joy. How are you
Wonderful.
doing? I know you're getting ready to welcome your newborn, so
Yeah, yeah.
what's been new on that front?
Well, as some of you might already know, that my wife and I are expecting our first child in May, so I've been writing like a madman trying to finish up my dissertation before she comes in mid-May. And this past week, I actually managed to put together her dresser, which was, I think, the first real thing I got to do for her since, the pregnancy. So it was nice to kind of feel useful in this process. So, but that's what's going on with us.
Excellent, thanks. Well, welcome, friends, to this public webinar of Yachad BeYeshua. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, Yachad BeYeshua, Together in Jesus, is an international ecumenical fellowship of Jewish disciples of Jesus who participate in diverse synagogue and church communities. We're happy to have you with us today for our third episode of the public, actually, I think this might be the fourth, webinar series. And I'm one of your hosts, Amanda Achtman. Today, our topic explores the life and legacy of Joseph Rabinowitz, who was among the first Jews to, in the modern era, to call for the establishment of distinct communities of Jewish disciples of Jesus, communities that would circumcise their sons and honor the Sabbath and the Jewish holidays. His views gained worldwide attention and launched a debate that is continuing to this day. We are now going to begin the webinar with a prayer in his honor that he put together. Come and let us return to the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He has struck us down, he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. Then shall we know, if we follow on to know the Lord, his going forth is prepared as the morning, and he shall come unto us as the rain, as the latter and the former rain unto the earth. Now we turn unto you with all the heart and soul. Our transgressions are known to us, and our sins are before us continually. Almighty God, Father of mercies, have mercy on us, miserable sinners. Have compassion on those who confess their sins. Return to them who turn from their evil ways, according to your promise made known to the children of men through Jesus the Messiah our Lord. And for his sake grant, merciful Father, that from this day we may walk in the fear of God, in righteousness and in uprightness, to the glory and praise of your holy name. Amen. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Jason, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Well, welcome everyone again. We're glad you're here as always. Just to reiterate, I'm Jason Morath, and I am pleased to introduce our guests for today's webinar. Dr. Richard Harvey, who has shared with us before, will come and share about Joseph Rabinowitz, who some have called the Herzl of Jewish Christianity and Messianic Judaism. And the webinar will also feature, for our faith journey portion, our very own Amanda Achtman. I'd like to just introduce Dr. Richard Harvey briefly. He is a UK-based Jewish disciple of Jesus who has served with the church's ministry among the Jewish people and as the UK director of Jews for Jesus. He has a liberal Jewish upbringing and became a follower of Jesus in 1974. He teaches Hebrew Bible and Jewish studies at All Nations Christian College, UK, and was academic dean and director of postgraduate studies. He is also a past president of the IMJA, the International Messianic Jewish Alliance, and currently serves as a vice president. And currently, he also serves as senior researcher with Jews for Jesus. He's married to Monica, who is also a Jewish believer in Jesus and has 2 children and 3 grandchildren. So before I hand it over to Dr. Harvey, just a reminder, after the interview and the story, we will have time for questions. So if you have a question during either the interview, during the time Dr. Harvey shares, or during Amanda's story, please write it in the Q&A, and I will consolidate them and ask them on your behalf during that time. And as a reminder, at the end of the webinar, Rabbi Dr. Mark Kinzer will provide some brief updates and announcements about Yachad BeYeshua. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Harvey. Well, Dr. Harvey, welcome. So tell us about Rabinowitz. What was new or distinct about what he was doing? What were some of his goals? How did he go about pursuing them?
Yeah, well, he was an amazing guy. We just prayed the prayer that he used in the morning service of his Messianic synagogue, we would call it today, the sons of the Israelites of the New Covenant. And let me just give you a little background with him and then focus on three key moments in his life, which I think will highlight his contribution. So he's born in 1837. He lives until 1899. And he grows up in Bessarabia, in the Pale of Settlement in Russia, Poland. His mother dies in his early childhood, but he's brought up by his Hasidic grandfather. And he's something of a prodigy. It's said that at the age of 6, he could recite the Song of Songs of Solomon in Hebrew off by heart. And at the age of 7, the Mishnah tractate, the tractate of the Jewish law, on the Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, at the age of 7. So he was clearly destined for a career as a rabbi, as an intellectual, as a child prodigy. One of the Hasidic rabbis said, be careful he doesn't become too precocious. Now, he was studying very hard within the Kabbalistic stream of Judaism, but around the age of 13, around his bar mitzvah, it's compulsory for all Jews in Russia to learn to speak Russian and to have a secularized Jewish education. They have to study Moses Mendelssohn's translation of the Tanakh. And then he's betrothed around the age of 16 and gets married, as you would do in those days. But the first key incident is when he arrives in Jerusalem. Now, the background is that pogroms, oppression and persecution has broken out in some 200 cities in Russia after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. And the Jewish communities, both religious and secular, are desperate to find some solution to the oppression and persecution they're experiencing. And he has become a well-known communal figure within the Jewish community of his day. He's an educator, he's a reformer, he's acting as a lawyer to help the Jewish people with their problems. He's also seeking to find either an agricultural colony that can be established in Bessarabia, or just possibly this place, Palestine, where these Zionists are already beginning to send people. He's refused permission to set up an agricultural colony in Russia. And so he goes as a delegate of the Jewish community leaders to Israel, to Palestine. And there he's actually very disappointed in what he sees. The Muslims are uttering insults on the Jews when they pray at the Wailing Wall. The plans for a Zionist colony is very much in the early stages. And he thinks, I don't know if this could ever be an option. But he's there on the Mount of Olives. I think you can see the slide there. And he's pondering the desperate plight of the Jewish people. And he's got with him, I don't know if you can see just inside his coat, there's a book at the top by his scarf. And that book is the New Testament. He's been given a New Testament in Hebrew, maybe some 15, 20 years earlier by his brother-in-law, Tzvi Yechiel Hershenson. And when he was given it, the brother-in-law said, perhaps, who knows, the answer to our problems is found in this book. And he is experiencing both tremendous heart searching and pain on behalf of his people, but also he gets this revelation, he gets this deep experience, and he realizes that the key to the Holy Land and the key to our people's need is in the hands of Yeshua Achinu, Jesus, our brother. And that for him is a turning point. He goes out a secular Zionist reformer, and he comes back with a mandate and a mission to say, well, actually, the answer is in the hands of this Jesus. Now, he doesn't become a Christian or anything like that. He's still very much a Jewish intellectual writer and journalist. But we get to the next stage of his beginning of this community, one of the first communities in modern times of Jewish disciples of Yeshua. There he is sitting at his desk. I don't know if you can see the photo on the screen. A man walked into my office a few years ago and said, I don't know if you've heard of my great-great-grandfather. His name was Joseph Rabinowitz. And he gave me this family photo. And his descendants all became believers in Yeshua, his sons and his 3 sons, his 3 daughters, and his wife. And immediately on returning from Israel, he begins to formulate this set of beliefs for the Israelites of the New Covenant. Most of them sound like a reforming agenda within the Jewish community, but the 7 of the 13 articles, the 7 last articles, speak about Yeshua being the Messiah, the son of David, the key to our people's needs. The Russian Interior Ministry gives him permission to hold public meetings, and they have the first meeting of this group called the Israelites of the New Covenant, really on Christmas Eve of 1884 in the Gregorian calendar. And there's even a Christmas tree there. The Jewish Chronicle reports that some 200 plus people came to these meetings. The secular Jewish newspapers couldn't quite believe it. They said, what is this man? He's a respected 45-year-old man in our community. What is he talking about? And there was tremendous excitement about this. And he publishes his 13 articles of faith based on the 13 articles of the Creed of Maimonides. And it really is quite an exciting development. And then just the third portrait of him, we've started in Jerusalem. We now go to Kishinev. And the third there's his articles of faith. I can come back to that, is in Berlin in 1885. He decides that he doesn't want to be baptized in any one denomination of the church. He realizes that baptism is important, but he also realizes what a tremendous stigma it is for Jewish people. And so in Berlin, in a Bohemian Lutheran church in 1885, using a creed and a declaration of belief that he's written himself, he's baptized with witnesses present from all the different groups and an American professor. Would you believe it has to be an American that comes over to Europe to do it? Charles Anderson does this baptism. So what is new about this? What is different to what had gone before? Well, I think that, this is the first time in modern times that a Jewish expression of faith in Yeshua is possible and is authorized by the Russian authorities and is there as a movement within the Jewish community. So he's done something that was only dreamed of previously. And of course, this means that it becomes internationally known, and it's really a movement within the Jewish community. Yeshua Achinu, the key is our brother Jesus.
That's really fascinating and a lot of connection going off in my mind. I was curious if you would talk a little bit about a little more about his motives in not wanting to be baptized by a particular denominations. What was his intent with that? As well as you've talked about his community, but what kind of impact did he have outside of his own particular community and the Jewish world? What kind of impact did he have in the Christian world?
Yeah, well, when we look at his impact, it immediately caught the public imagination, both locally, nationally, and internationally. The Russian Yiddish papers picked up on this because he was a key journalist for one of them, Hamelitz, and immediately it had a full-page spread. What's happened to Joseph Rabinowitz? And we know he's a good man. We know he's done so much for Jewish causes. He's part of our community. Is it really true? He's become a believer in Yeshua. The Russian press and people like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and particularly the Russian theologian Soloviev, Vladimir Soloviev, were very interested in this. Soloviev in particular was very supportive because he was trying to build what he was calling sobornost, an integration, not just of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church and even the Protestant churches, there were a few in Russia then, but even seeing that the Jewish people were part of this organic unity. And Soloviev, who's a wonderful theologian, very sympathetic to the Jewish people, published an article straight away, which was widely read, on how Rabinowitz was rediscovering the Jewishness that most Christians had forgotten. And he said that it's not so much the Jewish problem that we have today, it's the Christian problem, that Christians have failed to live up to what Jewish people are looking for in their Messiah. So the international coverage, it went into New York, it went into the London Times, which of course was the most prestigious newspaper then, was reporting on the meetings of Rabinowitz and really wondering what this new group was. There were a couple of other groups at the same time as the Israelites of the New Covenant that were like Jewish reform movements within the Jewish Pale of Settlement. One was a man called Jacob Priliker, and he had Novi Israel, New Israel. And so they were wondering, who is this guy? It also spurred on the development of what we now call Messianic Jewish congregations. In those days, they called them Hebrew Christian churches. And when news of Rabinowitz's movement started to get known, both in London, Toronto, New York, Chicago, even Israel, Jerusalem, Palestine, they started these Hebrew Christian assemblies, or Hebrew Christian churches, they called. So it was a big movement. He stayed independent of all the Christian denominations. He had some support financially from them, but he very much put out his own materials, as the community did. And then there was no official status for his group, because the Russian authorities would not let him do what the Protestants were allowed to do, or the Catholics. And so he was staying within the Jewish community very much.
That's so interesting to see how he kind of navigates, but doesn't quite fit clearly in a bunch of these different places. Which I think reminds me a lot of, I think, what Yachad BeYeshua is trying to do, and being have these relationships with between various denominations and interact, and not try to avoid some of these sectarian postures. So what would you say in that regard is the significance of Rabinowitz, his work, his story? How can he help us think about some of the questions that we have and that we face today?
Well, he was called the Herzl of Jewish Christianity, and I think in many ways he not only set the vision for what Jewish believers in Jesus might look for if they have their own independent congregations, their own polity, if you like. He wasn't just a visionary, he was also very practical. So he did set up this congregation. And even though there was a pogrom in 1903, which really wreaked havoc in Kishinev, his congregation continued right down to the 1920s and 30s, with others like Lev Yaakov Averbuch and Eric Garbe, who I knew in England. He was the pastoral assistant in that congregation. So what can we learn as Jewish disciples of Yeshua today? Well, Rabinowitz had a very ecumenical spirit, we might say. He was willing to work with anybody who had a love for the Jewish people, a love for Israel, and also a love for the Jewish Messiah. And he was able to network with Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox in quite an unusual way. I think he had his own very charismatic personality. One commentator said his sermons lasted 2 hours, but you wouldn't have believed it. So he was really the right person at the right time to model what does it mean to be Jewish and a believer in Yeshua, and part of the whole ecclesia, the whole body of believers in the Messiah. And then I think he also experienced some of the challenges that we experience, the relationships with the Jewish community. Most people respected him, but not all of them agreed with him. And he also had to navigate a careful position. He didn't want to use a lot of what he thought was very Christian Greek terminology. He was fully believing in Yeshua as the Messiah, the incarnate Son of God, but he didn't express it in those slightly Hellenistic terms. He had his own way of doing it. And I think that challenges us in our theological reflection, how we articulate our faith today, particularly in a Jewish context.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, Richard. This is so fascinating. And I already see that we have quite a handful of questions, and I know I have some of my own, but we'll save those for later. As always, sources for further reading will be provided in follow-up emails. So we always get questions about that, but know that those will be coming. So at this time, I would like to invite my co-host, Amanda Achtman, to turn her camera and microphone on as I introduce her to come share her faith journey with us. So Amanda is from Calgary, Alberta, and currently lives in Canada's capital of Ottawa. She studied political science in her hometown and recently completed a master's degree in John Paul II Philosophical Studies at Catholic University of Lublin in Poland. She has attended more than 100 seminars, conferences, and programs throughout North America, Europe, and the Middle East, and is currently working as an assistant to a conservative and foreign policy-minded member of parliament. So I've gotten to know Amanda a little bit over these past few months, and I am very excited to hear her story because she's a fascinating person. So please join me in welcoming Amanda as she shares her faith journey with us.
Thank you, Jason. Well, I'm delighted to share with all of you. I suppose I'll begin with saying that my mom's mother was Jewish, because this is a sentence on which all of my identity pivots and revolves, even though she was the only of my grandparents who I never had the opportunity to meet. She became Catholic before she married my Catholic grandfather. And so my mom was raised Catholic. She went to Catholic church and Catholic schools with limited knowledge of her Jewish roots, but still that was there. Then my mom ended up marrying a Jew from Montreal who agreed to raise a Catholic family, given the importance of the Catholic faith to my mother. And as my parents were preparing for marriage, they were going through marriage prep within the Catholic Church and going through all of the ordinary questions that couples consider as they're beginning to begin their lives together. And my dad offered to go to Mass every other Sunday with my mom, which the priest and my mom thought was pretty good for a Jew. My father had been raised up until his bar mitzvah, going to the synagogue with his twin brother. But around that time, after his bar mitzvah, my grandfather was becoming more skeptical of religion, and so didn't insist on the boys going to synagogue anymore. And so my father and my uncle would play hockey on Saturday mornings instead. My parents got married in the Catholic Church, and my mom, having been a lifelong Catholic, and my dad committed to raising a Catholic family because of the importance to her, while still not converting. And so this is how I came to be raised Catholic by my Jewish parents. My parents found common ground on the things that united them, and there are many. Through exploring our family history, they deepened in the traditions and had a sense of enthusiasm for exposing my brother and me to both traditions. They thought, wouldn't this be neat to give them some experience of both? And so my brother and I had some experience of Christmas and Hanukkah and Passover and Easter, a sort of cultural infusion of these traditions in our family life, which was really beautiful. It would be the same week that I'd go to the Outdoor Way of the Cross and the Jewish Film Festival at our local synagogue. As a child, I had a lot of religious sensitivity, and I always showed a keen interest in these things. When I was a teenager, my grandparents moved from Toronto to Calgary, and shortly after my bubby passed away, then Zeta moved in with my family. And he lived with us from the time that he was 89 until he passed away when he was 96. In this context, I got to become very close to him because I was in my high school and early university years. And so I learned about how he came to Canada from Poland in 1937. I learned about his upbringing and trajectory and how he had read the great books and then became more of a skeptic toward religion. We became very close. We went on dates at Italian restaurants. I would leave my term papers on his pillow and he would leave the Canadian Jewish news on mine. We had a very special relationship and it continues to nourish me to this day. He still hoped, however, that I would give up my belief in God and that I might do this by reading the great books of the tradition of Western civilization. And so I went on to pursue of my own interest a liberal arts degree. And he also thought, well, if studying the great books won't do it, then perhaps facing up to the history of the Holocaust would. And so I took that as kind of a dare from my Zeta and studied liberal arts. And in my first year of university, went on a Holocaust study trip to Germany and Poland with 2 survivors and 60 students from all across Canada. This trip was formative for me, and probably it's not an exaggeration to say that there isn't a day that goes by that I don't recall that trip in some way. Basically, it led me to question all sorts of topics and to engage with questions of Jewish identity, morality, and mortality. I remember thinking that if dehumanization is at the core of genocide, then what does it mean to humanize humanity? I wanted to know the antidote. And I also remember visiting Majdanek, a former camp, and pressing my hand against the monument, praying, Lord, etch this in my memory and engrave this upon my conscience, because I don't ever want to forget the testimony of the survivors that I've heard in this place. And so with that education and that question about what it means to humanize humanity, I studied political science, and I was attracted to especially German Jewish thinkers like Hans Jonas and Hannah Arendt. And I completed my studies in political science before going and working for a couple of years in practical advocacy and work in journalism at a startup. After that, I saw a 2-minute video promoting a master's program that was being offered for the very first time in English, an MA in John Paul II Philosophical Studies that was being offered at the Catholic University of Lublin. And I felt that God was saying, leave your country, go to the land that I will show you. It's Poland. And my grandfather had died only a week or 2 prior to me seeing this video. And so I felt a sense of permission and call to go and enter into this master's program and to live and steep in Jewish Catholic relations in the history of the 20th century and to study the life and thought of John Paul II and so many other noble lives that I would encounter. As soon as I got to Poland, I also realized that I was only 15 minutes away from Majdanek, the camp that I thought I would never return to again in my life, where I then became a regular volunteer. I felt if I was going to study in that city, that I certainly needed to go and be a volunteer and a guide and to give this history its due through my engagement with it. This was a time of cultivating my sense of responsibility and gratitude and wonder. And I think that responsibility and gratitude are 2 of the key themes that I really receive, particularly from the Jewish tradition. And yet I could find a way to achieve some synthesis of those key themes in my life within the life and thought of John Paul II. It was during my time in Poland that I went to Israel for my first time. It was a quick, cheap flight down from Warsaw to Israel. And since then, I have been 5 times on trips of different natures, from a Catholic pilgrimage to more Jewish-oriented trips to geopolitical trips. And all of this has cultivated in me a love for promoting pluralism and nuanced, humanizing approaches to the conflicts and tensions that we see. I'm telling the story in a brief way, and I hope you can see that the joy that these 2 traditions brings to me. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there is tension and there is angst, maybe not so much when I was a teenager, receiving it in a preliminary way with all sorts of openness, although I did study philosophy, and I am concerned with the truth, and I am active in both the Jewish and Catholic communities today. And so there certainly are experiences of tension, of confrontation, of difficulty, and even moments where I've questioned, is it really worth it? And in those moments where I've had that question and I've searched to try to ask and find if it's worth continuing it with this Jewish Catholic thread of my life, I have found that God is saying to me, receive the double gift. As long as you are receiving with gratitude and wonder these two traditions, then it will not be a source of angst, or at least it will be such, it will be so in such a way that is more than bearable, and that will bring a lot of new friendships, such as the friendships that I found in this community and others. So I'm very grateful for that. And I would also say that I have the sense that my family is most my family when we are doing the Jewish and Catholic things. This is the thread of continuity throughout my life. From all the places I've traveled and all the people I've met, I continue to receive the double gift of my Jewish Catholic faith. And that is a story that has begun and is set to continue. Thanks for letting me share it with you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, Amanda. There's a lot to think about there. I already have a couple questions that I know I would like to ask, but I will defer until later. But now we will begin our Q&A session. So I'd like to invite Dr. Harvey to also turn on his camera as we just delve into some of your questions. I see that Dr. Harvey has already provided some answers to them online, but I'd like to actually backtrack to one you've answered.
Yeah.
I was wondering, Dr. Harvey, if you would say more about Gentile presence in, or perhaps lack thereof, in Rabinowitz's congregation. So how much participation there was in that regard, but also a related question to that is, how somebody is asking, how come Rabinowitz and other believing Jews in Yeshua were not excommunicated, or how were they generally received by the wider Jewish community? So that kind of two sides of the same coin there.
Yeah, well, we've really got to think about the historical context, and it's not so much like they were living in a pluralistic secular society where everybody was rubbing shoulders with each other. These were Jewish communities in the Pale of Settlement, which was a network from the north, the Baltics, right down to the Black Sea, of Jewish communities within Russia and what is now Poland, Lithuania. And they were very much in a shtetl, or a small Jewish village context. And the Jewish communities were not voluntarily, but almost by force, kept separate from the wider Russian population, who were Russian Orthodox in general, a few Catholics, a very few Protestants. So the mingling between the groups, it's like Fiddler on the Roof, if you know the film. They didn't really mingle that much. So there wasn't many, there were a few missionaries and pastors, Pastor Fulton I mentioned, who was assisting Rabinowitz, excuse me, but there wasn't that much interaction between the different denominations in Kishinev. We know that the news of Rabinowitz's movement then caught this wave of publicity globally, and many different church leaders, Catholic bishops, Russian Orthodox intellectuals, Protestant leaders, people like D.L. Moody, Arno Gaberlein, and others in the American scene, they were all very interested. But on the ground, it was a Jewish movement within a Jewish community. So the second half, why weren't they excommunicated? Well, actually, Rabinowitz was a leading secular Jewish thinker who was arguing for reform of the rabbinate, reform of the Jewish community for most of his life before he became a believer in Yeshua. And he was accepted as a member of this Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. And of course, many of his secular friends didn't really follow the teachings of the rabbis that strictly. They lived a Jewish life. It was their culture. They all spoke Yiddish. but they didn't really embed themselves in the rabbinic establishment, which was largely Hasidic and Kabbalistic. And here Rabinowitz is following the secular trend of not really going along the way of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. And he's got strong things to say about this, which many of his secular allies and reformers would have agreed with.
There's a good follow-up question to that last point you made. There's been a couple of questions about comparative or comparative work with Rabinowitz and others, but also the influence he may have had. So somebody is particularly asking, was Rabinowitz influential on European Jewish thinkers, for example, Martin Buber, who also speaks of Jesus, our brother? So would you address that to some degree?
Yeah, so this phrase, Yeshua Achinu, Jesus our brother, we really do think is original with Rabinowitz. He's the first one in modern times that we know of who used the phrase like this. So when Martin Buber says Yeshua is my older brother, or Shalom ben Chorim Jewish thinkers, they are rediscovering and reclaiming the Jewishness of Jesus in a way that Rabinowitz had already given an example of. Now, the Jewish scholarship and people like the guy in New York, I've forgotten his name, but it'll come to me straight after this video. More and more Jewish scholars, David Ruderman, for example, has written a lot about this subject, are saying that these Jewish Christians, and Rabinowitz is one of the first of these, Alfred Edersheim is another, Adolf Safir is another, they were being read by the Jewish community and the Christian community. And although most Jewish intellectuals and scholars didn't want to say, yes, we believe Yeshua is the Messiah, they were certainly wanting to reclaim Jesus. You'd have to do a bit more drilling deeper to get an exact connection. But certainly Rabinowitz's movement sparked a global sensation here. Here, they thought for the first time since the New Testament was a community of Jewish disciples of Jesus, and they continued to practice circumcision, to keep the Sabbath, to keep kosher, to live within the Jewish community, to have Jewish weddings and bar mitzvahs, etc. So this was a model that hadn't been publicly realized for thousands of years.
Thanks. I want to come back to that in a minute, but at this point, I'd like to turn and ask Amanda a question. One of our attendees is asking something similar to that. What I was wondering is, what else are you doing to promote your Jewish understanding of things? But I was also wondering how the ways in which your Catholic practice inform your Jewish identity and your Jewish practices inform your Catholic identity. What could you say a bit about one, the dialectic between those, but also the influence of your background on the work you do in politics and how it's defined, and how moral responsibility from your religious formation has influenced your engagement with politics?
Wow, excellent questions. Thank you. This is why it's worth it for living these questions out. An example of how I have been sort of engaging my Jewish identity and trying to go deeper is definitely through texts. And so a while ago, some friends and I started a Jewish and Catholic, we didn't call it interfaith, we called it deliberately a Jewish and Catholic book club on Abraham Joshua Heschel. And this went on for about 2 years, where we read through more than 1,000 pages of Heschel and took turns hosting and forged some incredible friendships between my Jewish and Catholic friends, and got really to steep in the thought of Heschel. So that's just one example. And we presented together as friends on a Limud panel and things like that. As for the mutual enrichment of the traditions, this is so ongoing and virtually indistinguishable. Certainly when I even listen to a reading or a homily at Mass, and I can sort of live and feel more alive and alert to the drama with many of the readings now that I enter into some of the controversies and the difficulties of those cultures in in juxtaposition and in relationship with each other. And as for how it informs my current work, I'm so blessed to be in a space where I can do work that is directly emerging from my sense of wanting to humanize the culture. And so in my work in politics, lately I'm largely focused on combating the government's reckless expansion of euthanasia, and the expansion of euthanasia that eliminates the safeguards that were considered essential just a few years ago, and that really threatens persons with disabilities and the elderly. And so always with a heart for preserving human dignity and protecting the vulnerable, that's one area. And then the other area where there's an obvious connection from my education, which was not just the studies in philosophy, but which was also the 3 hours every Friday morning at Majdanek. Now I'm working hard with parliamentarians to raise awareness about the genocide against Uyghur Muslims in China. And so those are a couple examples of how my education and identity inform the work that I'm doing now. And I'm very grateful for that.
Absolutely fascinating work you're doing there. And I know plenty of our listeners are interested in learning more about what you're doing, or getting friends of theirs connected with you. So I'm sure we'll follow up with that afterwards. If I may ask you a follow-up question, because you focus more about the enriching formative parts, would you speak a little bit more about the angst or perhaps less than positive reception you received in either or both communities because of your dual identity?
Sure, there are examples all the time. The other day I was talking with a Jewish couple in Israel, and the man told me, well, as long as you're half Jewish and half Catholic, you're going to have these challenges in your life. And I said, okay, but I don't see it that way. I'm not half and half. I'm both. I'm both Jewish and Catholic. And I've had other times, I had an occasion to meet the chief rabbi of Rome one day when I was visiting Italy. And he said, and I asked him this question, I said, do you think it's worth me continuing to explore my Jewish identity while I intend to remain a committed Catholic? And it was a fraught conversation. And he said, certainly it's worth it, but ultimately you must decide. You have to choose. And so it was this sort of ominous sense of decision and it not being able to be both. I'll go to a Shabbaton in Toronto, and I'll be hosted for Shabbat, and sometimes genuinely want to live the Shabbat experience and have some experiences that I didn't necessarily have growing up. So I kind of lay low, but I'm also not evasive. If someone asks me about my Jewish upbringing, or if I went to these camps, or if I went to these schools and I don't have those ties, I need to account for them. And I explain that my parents are Jewish and I was raised Catholic. And this always produces really startled reactions of how could you sometimes? And even when I speak well of my father, who chose to come to Mass with us, even though he has not converted and says he doesn't intend to, some will say, well, not the greatest things about that decision, and think that I suffer for the lack of real Jewish participation and real Jewish identity more fully in the community. Nevertheless, I find the Jewish community of which I'm a part, in whichever city I live, only welcoming, only inviting. I'm always ever encouraged to do one more, take up one more thing, read one more text, join one more event. And so it has never been a matter of exclusion. So there's that sort of existential tension. And at the same time, because I'm Jewish, I find I always have a home in the Jewish community, and certainly that there is a home for Judaism within my Catholic faith. And that's something that I try to share with other Catholics. Sometimes it's a matter of celebrating Jewish holidays with my housemates who are Catholic, and giving them some context for things that they've never experienced before. And sometimes that's me discovering it for my first time as well. So many things.
Thank you for that. it resonates very deeply with me on a personal level to hear you talk about these things. And it's encouraging and both challenging to hear you share about the difficult conversations that you've had, and a reminder for me to want to engage in those kind of things as well. So I want to turn back to Dr. Harvey. We've had a couple questions about the influence of Rabinowitz, or perhaps the discontinuities with Rabinowitz and his movement on the modern Messianic Jewish movement of the 20th century. What would you say are the ways he influenced it, the ways in which I think, his movement may have died and another has, taken its place, maybe? I don't know if that's how you want to phrase it, but something along those lines. Would you just speak to those continuities and discontinuities?
Yeah, well, he was an amazing person. I think we would call him a charismatic with a small c leader. He was a preacher. He was a journalist and a writer. So his thoughts and his writings were widely spread and caught everybody's imagination, because here was somebody living it and doing it. The Hebrew Christian Alliance in Britain was formed in 1866. They formed a committee to support Rabinowitz's work in the 1880s. Adolf Safir was one of them. And then the impact of what he was doing led to the formation of these Hebrew Christian churches, especially in America, in Palestine. And then also it led to the Hebrew Christian Alliance of America getting started. I think people like Mark John Levy and Philip Cohen. I don't think he was an institution builder. I think that his movement really collapsed after his death, and with the pogrom in Kishinev, which was a nasty, almost genocidal pogrom, which really laid to the ground some of that community. But in the 1920s and 30s, his congregation reformed under another Jewish disciple, Lev Yakovitz Averbuch and Eric Garbe. And I think what we now see in the Messianic movement is that Rabinowitz was really a trailblazer like Theodor Herzl, something of a dreamer, but he did establish this community. And I think we are indebted to him today. And also he had the Yiddishkeit. He really was a prodigy in Talmud, in Mishnah, in Kabbalah, but he then became more secular reformer. And many of us, especially in the modern Messianic movement, we don't have that much Jewish education, some of us. And so we are rediscovering what that means. And Rabinowitz gives us one pathway into that.
To develop that question and kind of look the other direction in history, Alan Gilman was wondering about the relationship with early Jewish Jesus-following groups. And one of the things that came up in my mind in your presentation is his revelatory experience, and I can't help but you hear echoes of the Damascus Road. So I'd be curious to if you would elaborate on how Rabinowitz perceived Paul, but also some of these other early Jewish Jesus-following groups, even past the New Testament.
Well, Alan mentions the Ebionites, and of course the Ebionites, that was a term of abuse because it really comes from the Hebrew word poor, because the Ebionites were accused by people like Epiphanius and Eusebius of being poor in their doctrine because they didn't accept the full deity of Yeshua. Now, actually, Rabinowitz was given the same charge by some Christian leaders that he wasn't fully Trinitarian, or he wasn't fully, he was still keeping the Torah, he was still keeping kashrut. So he had the same slurs put against him. But what he did, and he did this partly with the help of Rudolf Fulton, this Lutheran pastor who was in the area, is he put together his own 13 articles of faith. And he said, no, I may not be using the language of a sort of Greek Christian Hellenistic terminology, but I'm still fully believing in Yeshua, son of David, divine Messiah, etc., in an Orthodox way. And leading scholars like Franz Delitzsch came to his aid and said, yes, we recognize that this is an authentic expression of Jewish discipleship in Yeshua. Another thing to mention, I think he was a complex man. I mean, I have this photo of him that was given to me of him sitting at his desk doing his work. And I like to think what was really going on in his head. He's straddling these major traditions of being Jewish and believing in Jesus. And I think he told his story in a way that appealed to different groups. So for the American evangelicals like D.L. Moody, it was like a conversion experience. But really from within the Jewish context, and Jewish scholar Steve Zipperstein has written about this, he is a typical reforming Jewish intellectual. And his progression of seeing Yeshua Achinu as the answer to our people's political needs, social needs, educational needs, because we're going through persecution in Russia, was not so much a personal inner spiritual experience, but a moment of if you like, political realization of a philosophy of what our people really need at this time. We don't just need Aliyah to Israel, which he was interested in, but not fully convinced in. We don't just need full retreat from Judaism, the religion, into a secular identity. We need something more. We need a leader who can take our people from the situation we're in now to a situation where we are overcoming our problems. And so for him, Yeshua Achinu was the answer to the whole of the Jewish question, as it was called. Soloviev, his friend, this very leading Orthodox philosopher and theologian, said it's not really the Jewish question, it's the Christian question. And Rabinowitz is answering the Christian question by showing us what Christians need to be in order to know that Yeshua is the Jewish Messiah. So I think his solution is much bigger than just a personal story. It's about the way that the church and Israel really do belong together and need to be reconciled. Sobornost was Soloviev's phrase, to be brought back into a unity of diverse parts.
Thank you. Just briefly, I'd like to give our last question to Amanda. Would you just briefly share with us the impact of Pope John Paul II on Jewish-Christian relations, and how studying him and his work has been formative in both your identity, your practice, and how you engage those same questions?
Sure. So I could not have imagined that I would go to Poland and study John Paul II when I first began to take an interest in him, which was really when he died. And I was seeing all the magazine covers and all the news, and that was kind of a wake up to how influential he had been. And then learning through the course of my studies and traveling in this very experiential way throughout Poland really gave me a lot of access points to navigating the Jewish Catholic relations, also Polish Israel relations, which are also very tense. And the drama is kind of sometimes sad and sometimes thrilling and always meaningful. And so going to Wadowice, John Paul II's hometown, and seeing that he lived in a home owned by Jews, and he had many Jewish schoolmates and friends with whom he grew up in Wadowice, and that really throughout his entire life, the success of his Jewish Catholic efforts were all the result of friendship. And I think that's the real lesson and witness. I was inspired to go study him because George Weigel, the Pope's biographer, had said, "The noble life is still the most compelling witness for the fundamental truths that are the basis of our common world," and how much we need a sense of the common world and the common good. And so I really consider him a guide in this respect, a guide who teaches us that friendship is the path to love and to covering some of the difficulties with which we might get too taken by if not for just letting that love overshadow and overcome the difficulties. So I think that's why Yachad BeYeshua is a beautiful community that is really centered on these kinds of friendships that will always be a continual reminder to us of why all of this is worth it and deep and meaningful as we each have our relationship with God.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for your wonderful questions, and Amanda and Richard for your fantastic answers. That concludes our question and answer portion. So I would like to just hand it over to Amanda for some concluding comments.
Sure. All right. Again, we'd like to remind you that the Yachad BeYeshua website is up. You receive information by email. There are the past webinars, a blog, some resources there. And that's yachad-beyeshua.org. You can check there, subscribe there, direct others there. And if you appreciate these events and would like to support the work, you can also make a contribution on the website, and we'd be very grateful for that. We'll also be shifting these webinars to a bi-monthly pattern. So our next one will be on Wednesday, April 14th in this same time slot. That one will focus on the life and ministry of the Russian Orthodox martyr, Father Alexander Men. Our presenter will be Father Michael Mearson, a close friend of Father Alexander and a founding member of Yachad BeYeshua. We will also hear from Deborah Pardo-Kaplan, a Messianic Jewish journalist who will share about her journey as a Jewish disciple of Yeshua. And now I would like to hand it over to Rabbi Dr. Mark Kinzer for some concluding remarks and announcements.
A special thanks to you, Amanda, and to Richard for another very inspiring, illuminating session. I wanted to mention, I sometimes get emails asking if these are emails from Christian friends who are not Jewish, and they say, is it okay if we attend these Yachad BeYeshua public webinars? And I always say, of course, these are public webinars. We're eager to have everybody who might have an interest in what Yachad BeYeshua is doing, either as a future member or a friend or just someone who's inquisitive to be attending these public webinars. And even more so, I recommend it for all of you who are either members of Yachad BeYeshua or who are just enjoying attending these. Let your friends know, and pass the word around. We are eager for more and more people to become aware of what we're doing in Yachad BeYeshua. I announced at our last webinar that we had hoped to begin receiving applications for membership in Yachad BeYeshua in the near future. Unfortunately, there's been some delays in our being able to get the process set up, but we're pretty confident that this will be available within the next couple of months, and we will be keeping you informed through emails. So please be patient with us and support us in your prayers. So without anything further, I will just offer a concluding prayer. Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father in heaven, we are grateful for the witness of Joseph Rabinowitz, for the way in which he loved you and loved your people Israel, for the love that he had for Yeshua and the way in which he saw him in his identity and life as a Jew, as the source of Israel's life, the source of the world's life and redemption. And we thank you for the way he wrestled with his own identity and his own calling and your calling on the life of the Jewish people. We also thank you for our friend and our sister Amanda, and for the witness of her life, and for the calling that you've given to her. And we all, particularly those of us who are Jewish disciples of Yeshua, we pray that you would help us to wrestle more deeply with our particular calling, our vocation, and that we might be faithful to you in everything. We ask this through Yeshua the Messiah, in the one Spirit, to the glory of your holy name.
Amen. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.